Welcome, folks, to this video lesson about federalism. I am Miss Jennifer Blank, and I will be your guide on this journey. Also here to help us for at least a couple of minutes until she gets sick of it is my beautiful cat, Arbus, who also bids you a wonderful hello. And I think she might be over it at this point, but we'll see how... Oh, she's done, and we're gone. Okay, so anyway, federalism, folks, federalism. So this is going to happen in three parts, all right? This is going to happen in three parts. Part one, which you're watching right now, is going to talk about key vocabulary, the definition of federalism, so we actually know what we're talking about, and also different systems of government. And we want to understand how federalism is different. What makes the United States actually unique, right? Or at least what made it unique originally before other nations started to copy us a little bit with federal systems. So part two will go into their different types of federalism, and then part three, we're going to look at how federalism actually works, how that power is divided, looking at how different branches of government use that power, apply that power, and that will wrap up our lessons on federalism. So here we go. So federalism in and of itself, here's a definition up here, right? It's a division of power between one national government and several state or regional governments, okay? So you have one big national government, and then underneath it, you've got state, right? So the Federalist Papers, which outline what the federal system was all about, what the system of U.S. government was all about, they were a series of essays written by the Founding Fathers. They wanted to persuade people to actually ratify the Constitution. I have a whole video lesson on Federalists versus Anti-Federalists, so please consult that for further details. So the three authors of the Federalist Paper were John Jay, Alexander Hamilton, and James Madison. He was also known as the father of the Constitution, so please keep that in mind for the AP exam. A federal mandate is a legislative provision that requires state and local governments to follow federal law or lose funding. In part three, we're going to talk in more detail about federal mandates, also a little bit in part two as well. A faction. This was the subject of Federalist 10, folks. So in my class, we've already covered this, but in other classes, this is going to be really, really important for the AP exam. Federalist 10 is one of the required documents that you need to know for the exam. So faction is a group of people, either a minority or a majority, who have a singular goal that may be detrimental to the common good of society. And Federalist 10 explains why that is such a major problem. All right, so let's keep going. Some additional details of federalism. I know I just talked about this, but I really want to make sure that we're all on the same page, we understand. Okay, so power of government is split between the states and the federal or national government. If the Constitution does not have a law, the states can basically do what they want about this. This is what the 10th Amendment is all about. But state law cannot contradict federal law. That is what the Supremacy Clause is all about. Now, there's this concept called dual sovereignty, okay? Dual sovereignty. Dual meaning two, and sovereignty meaning where power resides, right? When we say the people are sovereign, it means political power resides or lives in the people. So dual sovereignty means that whatever the federal government does not make a law about, the states can act however they choose, okay? As long as it doesn't violate the Constitution, the states are in control of it. So this is why you do have different state laws regarding alcohol, driving, death penalty, and a lot of other issues, including marijuana also at this point as well. So now let's talk about the different kind of systems. So we've been talking about a federal system, but there are a couple of other systems. One is a unitary system. Now, before the Founding Fathers came up with what they came up with, pretty much everything was a unitary system for the most part. You have a central government that has total power, and whatever power they decide to give up goes to subnational governments, right? They decide how much power and what power these other areas of government get. But it's the central government that has complete authority and all the power. They decide who gets what. So local governments typically only have those powers that are given to them by the central government. There are no powers that are just theirs. They only get what the national government says they can get. And this is especially important in this. The central government controls the funds, the money, the cash. So the central government really not only has the political power, but also has the economic power as well. This kind of system is ripe for corruption. He who has the money makes the rules. I don't know if you've heard that old axiom, that old truism. But when you have absolute power concentrated in one entity, it's going to become corrupt. And it's not going to take very long for that to happen. So in a confederal system, which is what the United States started out as before we shifted to the Constitution and the federal system, that's where power is retained by local or regional governments. The Articles of Confederation are an example of this. A modern example would be the European Union, and there's a description of what that is down there. Okay, so a federal system, we've been talking about this. I can't repeat this enough. Like, I can't possibly overemphasize this. You must memorize this definition. Memorize it, memorize it, memorize it. Okay? Divides power between national and local, lower level governments. Each government has distinct powers that the other cannot override. So some examples, in addition to us, got Australia, Brazil, Canada, Germany, India, and Mexico. So there's some other nations, modern nations, that currently exist within a federal system. So why did the founders pick federalism? Like, why pick this at all? Well, they wanted to combine a central government that was strong enough to maintain order, but not allow that central government to get too much power. Because if you allow the central government to have too much power, it's going to become corrupt. So that was a key reason. The Articles didn't do the job. The central government didn't have enough power to unify the states, and we were vulnerable to a lot of different things, but things were not working. And again, I have a video lesson on this, so if you need more details about the Articles of Confederation, go check out that video lesson. Another reason was we were a very large country, and we're still a very large country in comparison to most others, but even at that time, and we hadn't even fully expanded yet, just the 13 colonies were large. We have large geographic size, so you need a new system that's going to accommodate that. State governments have also, yet another reason, have also served as training grounds for new ideas and new politicians where you can test ideas at the local level. And if they work and work well, you can expand that to the national level and apply it to other states. But it's nice to have each state be able to experiment a little bit so you can come up with systems that work. If something doesn't work, it's only one state that has the issue, and it's not the whole country, right? Federalism also allows for a lot of political subcultures, and this is central to Federalist 10 and the controlling of majority faction. Okay, pluralism is the answer, the extended sphere argument. You want to expand the number of factions so that each faction competes with one another, and no one or two or three factions is able to consolidate so much power that they ruin society. Right? So federalism allows for these multiple subcultures that these other systems of government don't really allow for. All right, so this is a graphic of how that works. So unitary, you see all the arrows are coming from because the power comes from there. Confederal, power comes from the states, and whatever power they decide to give the central government is it. And then here you see in federal system, the arrows go back and forth, right? There's a division of power. That each side can't infringe or can't mess up the other side, right? That's the idea behind it, a balance of the flow of power. So, powers of the national government, let's talk about this. There are enumerated powers. The word enumerated, and you should write this down, means to list. List. Enumerated powers are listed powers, okay? But we also have the necessary and proper clause, which allows the federal government to go a little bit outside those enumerated powers. So there are certain things that weren't listed in the Constitution the federal government needs to do in order to fulfill the listed powers that they must do, right? There's also implied powers is really connected to the necessary and proper clause. This allows the national government to make decisions that fall outside the expressed or enumerated in order to fulfill their duties. And inherent powers are powers that every nation has that are recognized by all other nations, right? So the power to conduct foreign policy and make treaties, for example, is a power that is recognized by all other nations that each sovereign nation has. Okay, so the power of state governments, and this is where the 10th Amendment comes into play. 10th Amendment is really, really important, and it was a deal breaker for the Anti-Federalists. If they didn't get their 10th Amendment, they weren't going to ratify. But the Federalists said, okay, you know what? We hear you, we see you, Anti-Federalists, and we're going to make a compromise here. And that compromise was the 10th Amendment. So all powers that explicitly states, like really spells out, anything in this document that isn't given to the feds belongs to the states. The Anti-Federalists were really keen on having this in there. So in theory, states still retain all powers that aren't explicitly listed Okay, but that we didn't stick with that mantra. We didn't stick with that idea. Folks, we have massively expanded the power and scope of national government action on a scale that our founders never anticipated. And I would like you to consider the fact that perhaps some of the key reasons that we have such corruption and problems in the national government is because we've just given it too much dang power. Something that I want you to think about. This is an idea that we're going to explore. And not just too much power, but which power should the federal government take that they shouldn't have right now. These are issues we're going to explore throughout the course. And it's going to be really important that we form some opinions about these things, because in a few short years, in just a short time, you're going to be voting. Okay, you're going to be voting, and you're going to have to choose politicians that are going to change the direction or keep it the same, the direction of the national government. And these are things we need to be thinking about. So powers of state governments, we've talked about this in class, my folks, we've talked about this in class. Police power is the authority to legislate for the protection of the health, moral, safety, and welfare of the people. Now, the federal government does have some limited powers in this regard, but the founders designed the Constitution to have most of that police power reserved to the states. This was purposeful, because if the federal government controlled this power as well, you are asking for corruption. You don't want the national government to have this much control over the day-to-day life of citizens, according to the founders' theory. And this is another breakdown. Concurrent powers are powers that state and national government or state and federal government shares. Okay, so you have concurrent powers. Both the national and state government have them. Both national and state governments do have the power to tax. They have the power to make and enforce laws. They have the power to establish courts. They do both have the power to police, but the national government's power in this regard is very limited. It's very narrow in its scope. Okay, it's a very narrow little line that they have to walk. So there are prohibited powers. These are powers that are forbidden. Now, the national government have some prohibited powers, and the state government have some prohibited powers. So, for example, the national government is prohibited from taxing exports, products that are leaving the country, products that Americans sell to other countries. State governments are prohibited or forbidden from engaging in foreign policy, like having negotiations and signing treaties with other countries, and from creating currency. If you recall in the video lesson of Articles of Confederation, we had some problems. Shays' Rebellion was a result of those money problems because each state was having issues regulating its own currency. So in the Constitution, we gave the federal government that authority. States cannot coin money. They cannot create currency. We've talked about this too. So Supremacy Clause, this is in Article 4. Any law that the federal government passes is supreme. It will then nullify other state laws in existence, okay? And the states cannot pass any laws that conflict with national federal laws, okay? Now, this is regarding a legitimate action of the national government. And there have been times when the national government has made a law and the state took them to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court said, you know what? You're right, states. That's not a legitimate action of government, so bye-bye law. The law is unconstitutional. But if it's a legitimate action, based on the Constitution, if the law is legitimate, if it's constitutional, it will always be resolved in favor of the national or federal government. So we have two sides here. There are people who think federalism is good, and then the next slide I'm going to talk about why federalism is bad, right? So living under two governments is great. You have to compromise because you have two different sets of power sharing. So this promotes unity. You have to find a way forward together. You can't just do your own thing. You have to compromise. Government duties can be split up. So one part of government isn't responsible for everything. Because if that happens, you'll find that one part of government that's responsible, they won't be able to do everything well. They're going to drop the ball on most things, if not all things, because it's simply too much for them to handle. It does bring government closer to the people because it forces folks to engage in local and state politics and not just pay attention to the federal, or vice versa. It does allow for the state governments to address issues that are particular to that state. Okay, there are certain issues that Midwesterners face that Texas does not. You know, Kansas has certain problems that Texas doesn't, and California still has other problems that Florida doesn't, right? So it allows the states to to address their own unique issues without having to wait for a federal solution that might help them but harm somebody else. So these are the reasons why federalism is good. But no system is perfect. There are reasons why federalism can be considered bad, right? States can actually stop the progress of the nation, right? States can put up a stink, make a fuss, and stop progress that should be happening at the federal level. States are unequal, right? And different states with different policies can create confusion among folks. Like what happens if you're living in Florida but move to California and the laws are different? Now it's going to be a little bit tricky because maybe because you could do it in Florida, you thought you could do it in California, you didn't realize that you can't, and now you could create a whole lot of problems, right? Or have a whole lot of problems that you didn't think you'd have to deal with. In some ways, some people have argued it's easier for states to be dominated by interest groups because of this division of power. So now we also have, because we have checks and balances from the national government in the form of separation of powers among the three branches. But federalism offers a vertical check, right? So horizontal check is like, okay, you have, Congress, executive, judicial, right? And they're all on the same level. That's a horizontal, right? And we have checks and balances and separation of powers between those three. But now we have vertical, federal, state, right? So there's checks and balances and separation of powers vertically as well. So the founders didn't want to take any chances. They doubled up on everything. So federalism offers some vertical checks and balances, which is helpful for preventing concentration of power. Remember, concentration of power equals corruption. So we want to stop that corruption. We want to stop that concentration of power so we can try to avoid or lessen the amount of corruption that we experience. And that, folks, is the end of part 1. I hope you learned what you needed to, and I will see you in the next video.